How did the Cold War happen? A historian's tale of betrayal and paranoia. In 1945, as World War II ended, the world's superpowers found themselves on opposite sides of a new global divide. The United States and the Soviet Union, once allies against Nazi Germany, soon became rivals. Deep ideological differences, democracy versus communism, sparked suspicion and competition. As the Soviets expanded their influence across Eastern Europe, the West grew wary. This tension, fueled by mutual distrust and the race for technological and military superiority, ignited what became known as the Cold War. The year was 1945. Two men sat across from each other at a polished conference table in Yalta, their faces weathered by war, but their eyes sharp with ambition. One was a chain-smoking Georgian who had clawed his way from poverty to absolute power. The other, a wheelchair-bound aristocrat who had guided his nation through its darkest hour. They smiled, shook hands, and carved up the world between them. Within 3 years, they would be mortal enemies, dragging humanity to the brink of nuclear annihilation. This is the story of how the greatest alliance in human history became the most dangerous rivalry the world has ever known, and how a Cold War nearly turned very, very hot. The alliance that was never meant to be. The Soviet-American partnership during World War II was always a marriage of convenience, not love. Joseph Stalin and Franklin D. Roosevelt were ideological opposites, forced together by a common enemy, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. Stalin commanded a communist empire built on the bones of millions, while FDR championed democratic capitalism. Yet for 4 brutal years, they fought side by side, sharing intelligence, coordinating massive military operations, and promising each other a peaceful post-war world. But beneath the surface, suspicion festered like an infected wound. Stalin had never forgotten that the Western Allies delayed opening a second front in Europe until 1944, leaving the Soviet Union to bleed against the Wehrmacht for 3 agonizing years. 27 million Soviets died, a number so staggering it defies comprehension. Meanwhile, American casualties numbered around 400,000. To Stalin, this wasn't coincidence. It was calculation. The capitalists, he believed, were content to let communists and fascists destroy each other. Roosevelt, for his part, grew increasingly alarmed by Soviet behavior in Eastern Europe. As the Red Army rolled westward, it didn't just liberate, it occupied. In Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary, Soviet officials systematically dismantled democratic institutions and installed puppet governments. The Atlantic Charter's promise of self-determination became a cruel joke, replaced by what Churchill would later call an Iron Curtain. The moment. Everything changed. February 1945. The Big Three, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, met at Yalta to decide the fate of the post-war world. The photographs show them laughing, toasting, seemingly in perfect harmony. But the devil was in the details of their agreements, and those details would soon tear the world apart. Stalin promised free elections in Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe. He lied. Roosevelt believed Soviet cooperation was possible if America showed good faith. He was wrong. Churchill warned that Stalin was building a new empire. He was ignored. When Roosevelt died just 2 months later, Harry Truman inherited not just the presidency, but a geopolitical powder keg. Unlike FDR, Truman had no illusions about Soviet intentions. At their first meeting, he told Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov exactly what he thought of Soviet treaty violations. Molotov, accustomed to Stalin's paranoid rage, but unaccustomed to American bluntness, stammered that he had never been spoken to like that in his life. "Carry out your agreements," Truman shot back, "and you won't get talked to like that again." The honeymoon was over. The spy who started it all. But here's where the story takes a darker turn, one that reveals just how deep the mistrust ran and how a single defector would shatter any remaining hope for cooperation. September 1945. Igor Guzenko, a cipher clerk at the Soviet embassy in Ottawa, walked out with 109 documents tucked under his shirt. These weren't ordinary diplomatic cables. They were proof of a massive Soviet spy network operating throughout North America, stealing atomic secrets and infiltrating the highest levels of government. The Guzenko affair revealed that while Stalin publicly called for international cooperation, he was secretly running espionage operations designed to steal Western military technology and undermine democratic governments. The most shocking revelation? Soviet spies had penetrated the Manhattan Project itself, feeding Stalin detailed information about America's atomic bomb program, even as the Allies fought together. Truman was furious. Stalin was unrepentant. Trust, already fragile, shattered completely. The race was now on, not just for nuclear superiority, but for the soul of the post-war world. The doctrine that divided the world. March 12, 1947. President Truman stood before Congress and delivered what would become known as the Truman Doctrine, a speech that officially declared the Cold War, though he never used those words. At the present moment in world history, nearly every nation must choose between alternative ways of life, Truman declared. One way of life is based upon the will of the majority and is distinguished by free institutions. The second way of life is based upon the will of a minority forcibly imposed upon the majority. It was a line in the sand drawn in black and white, with no room for gray. You were either with the free world or against it. Stalin, listening from the Kremlin, understood the message perfectly. He responded by tightening his grip on Eastern Europe and accelerating Soviet nuclear development. George Marshall's recovery plan for Europe, the Marshall Plan, followed quickly. Officially, it was humanitarian aid to rebuild war-torn Europe. Unofficially, it was economic warfare designed to contain Soviet influence. Stalin saw it as an attempt to buy European loyalty and forbade his satellite states from participating. The continent split in two. Western Europe chose dollars and democracy. Eastern Europe got rubles and repression. When the world held its breath, the Cold War's most terrifying moment came not in Cuba or Berlin, but in a place most Americans couldn't even pronounce. Able 1 and Baker 1, the code names for the first nuclear tests after World War II. July 1946. Bikini Atoll. As mushroom clouds bloomed over the Pacific, Soviet scientists watched from afar and accelerated their own atomic program. Stalin understood that in the nuclear age, second place meant obliteration. August 29, 1949. The Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, years ahead of Western intelligence estimates. The American nuclear monopoly was over. Truman received the news with characteristic directness. This means we have no time left. The arms race had begun in earnest. Within a decade, both superpowers would possess hydrogen bombs thousands of times more powerful than the weapons that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world had never been closer to accidental annihilation, and it would remain balanced on that knife's edge for the next 40 years. The psychology of fear. What transformed wartime allies into existential enemies wasn't just ideology or geopolitics. It was fear. Stalin feared encirclement by capitalist powers and saw American economic aid as a weapon aimed at Soviet security. Truman feared Soviet expansion and saw communist parties in Western Europe as Trojan horses for Soviet domination. Both men believed they were acting defensively. Both were probably right. Both were certainly wrong to think the other side would back down. The Cold War wasn't the result of a single decision or dramatic betrayal. It emerged from 1,000 small choices, misunderstandings, and moments when leaders chose suspicion over trust, confrontation over compromise. It was the product of two incompatible visions of human organization colliding in a world where nuclear weapons made the stakes existential. The legacy of that handshake. That handshake at Yalta, the one that seemed to promise so much, ultimately promised nothing. Stalin and Roosevelt were never really partners. They were rivals temporarily united against a common threat. Once Hitler was defeated, their fundamental differences made conflict inevitable. The Cold War lasted 44 years, cost trillions of dollars, and brought the world to the brink of nuclear war multiple times. It divided families, toppled governments, and turned entire continents into proxy battlefields. Yet, in a strange way, it also prevented World War III. The very horror of nuclear weapons forced both sides to fight their battles through surrogates, spies, and economic competition rather than direct military confrontation. Understanding how the Cold War began reminds us that even the closest alliances can fracture when fear overwhelms trust, when ideology trumps pragmatism, and when leaders choose to see enemies where they might have found partners. The ghosts of Yalta still haunt us today, whispering warnings about the fragility of international cooperation and the terrible cost of letting suspicion spiral into hatred. The handshake that was supposed to secure the peace instead started the longest war in human history. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who once called you friend.